Before we start, we would like to inform the attendees that this seminar will not include oral interventions, but questions can be submitted via the Q&A feature. We will start first with our first panelist, Mr. Nabil Abdel-Hafiz. Mr. Nabil, as the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Human Rights, in addition to your extensive history and experience in defending human rights, we turn to you regarding the pathways of transitional justice in Yemen, as well as the role of the government in providing justice and protection for the victims and in promoting reconciliation and purifying the national memory. And so the first question is, what efforts are being made both at the official and unofficial levels on the path of transitional justice in terms of legislative and institutional development? And what role does the Ministry of Human Rights play in preserving the memory of victims or memorializing victims? Over to you, Mr. Nabil. Thank you very much, Laila. I would like to thank you and all of the colleagues who participated in organizing this session. And I would also like to express my thanks and appreciation to the Sana'a Center. This is an excellent initiative, one that is very important for human rights activities, for there to be a week for transitional justice with several seminars and discussions and platforms is a very timely intervention and one that is much needed in order for us to pressure for the implementation of a transitional justice process. As we all know, the transitional justice process started with some light discussions after 2006 or after the experience in Morocco in 2004. And this is when discussions in Yemen started on the topic of transitional justice and how the Moroccan experience
لهذا الأمر في كثير من الدول وجدوا أنها فرصة حقيقية.
And this was seen as a real opportunity for reparations for the victims and to work on the collective memory in Yemen so that we can truly transition to a civil, modern, and democratic state, the state that we all aspire to. And this was especially true after the popular youth revolution in 2011. And so the process, as I said, started with many political discussions being undertaken, including the discussions and dialogues on ratifying the Rome Statute of the ICC by Yemen. And these discussions were held in 2006 and 2007. There was also the rise of the Southern Movement, or the Hirak, in 2007, which presented an additional package of bundle of grievances with the due to the civil war in 1994 and the repercussions of that conflict, with the laying off of many military and civilian personnel and the confiscation of land. And there had also been accumulated grievances and violations from previous periods, but the conclusion, this was a very serious step that was taken by the government, and this was a proposal by the Ministry of Legal Affairs and Human Rights in which they presented a draft transitional justice law, which was presented to Parliament. Unfortunately, discussions continued to be contentious due to the political fears among all of the various political actors, whether the ruling party at the time, parties that had been ruling parties previously, or parties that had been supportive or aligned with the ruling regimes throughout various stages of Yemen's modern history. The second serious step for the implementation of transitional justice came with the formation of a transitional justice working group in the National Dialogue Conference. And this working group that was formed, or that was announced as one of the 9 working groups of the National Dialogue Conference, also expressed some of the same concerns and fears by adding additional issues. And this working group was called the Transitional Justice and Other National Issue Working Group. And many of these issues included issues like qat, the environment, and other open-ended issues. which showed that the political environment or the political actors at the time had significant fears about the work of this working group. And so they wanted to add additional topics or issues to further distract the working group from purely discussing transitional justice. And so in conclusion, the working group from the NDC presented a number of excellent proposals, and the draft transitional justice law I believe was also an excellent draft, but there were two main issues that were in conflict when it came to this. The first is the political perspective or the political vision of the major parties, and these were the parties that had been ruling or were participating in ruling coalitions, and they strove for a transitional justice that amounted to amnesty and national reconciliation immediately. But there were also demands by opposition parties as well as grassroots groups that believe that transitional justice needs to go through all of its processes akin to other experiences around the world, and that it would need to go through these natural stages, starting with fact finding and revealing the truth, and then accountability and prosecution, and then recognition and acknowledgement, and finally reaching the stage of reparations and compensation for the victims until a national reconciliation is reached, before which there would also need to be institutional reforms and guarantees of non-repetition. And these stages, there were also government efforts, and I think this is something that the presidency of the country should be commended for, with the establishment of the National Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations. And we believe that this had been a serious step, but this commission also reflected the political fears of the political actors, and the decree to form this commission limited its mandate to events that had occurred after 2011. And so there was an attempt to try to avoid dealing with many of the case files from the previous periods. And the second problem or the second challenge was the issue of the time frame that would be set, where the transitional justice process would start from. And the problem here was that the General People's Congress, for example, wanted to focus on transitional justice that with a time frame starting in 2011 with the youth revolution. The Socialist Party also wanted the time frame of transitional justice to start after beginning in 1990 on, and the Nasrists, or the Nasrist Unionist Organization, wanted it to start in 1972 when Nasrists were tried and persecuted in the north, and then the trials in 1978 after the attempt to remove Saleh from power at the beginning of his reign. And there were parties that said, if we want to truly transition from our past, we need to start from 1962 in the north and 1963 as the south, as the beginning of the revolution and the beginning of the national movements, and these national fronts or national movements coming to the forefront of the political environment. But all of these different opinions, there was no consensus that was reached on the time frame of transitional justice. And the issue of whether it would be a comprehensive transitional justice process or if it would be amnesty and national reconciliation continued to be the main challenges facing any discussions of transitional justice. And the fourth step that I think is an important step that the political leadership should be commended on is the formation of the CRC, which is the Commission for Reconciliation and Consultation. And it includes 5 teams, and one of the main teams or subcommittees in the CRC is the National Reconciliation Committee, and it is working on rethinking this issue politically with the inclusion of all of the different political actors represented in the CRC in order to reach a national reconciliation with as little harm done as possible. We are still waiting for the results of the work of this committee and the CRC as a whole, and we believe that their work is very important and urgent in order for us to reach perspectives that would mobilize grassroots support and allow or push the political leadership to take an additional step forward for the implementation of transitional justice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nabil, for this excellent overview that you've given us, which gave us a better understanding of transitional justice discussions in Yemen and what has been achieved. But I wanted to go back to the core of the question of what exactly is it that is hindering the government from ratifying the Convention on Enforced Disappearance? I think this is a very important question, and when we presented the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, the fourth, which was presented in May 2024, we had received many questions on this topic, and a number of recommendations were given. And these recommendations, there were 12 recommendations, if I remember it correctly, that pertain to the issue of enforced disappearance due to its importance. And as we all know, enforced disappearance is one of the main problems facing transitional justice, of how to deal with enforced disappearance, either in previous stages or in this stage, and that this is an important entry point. And so these suggestions, the 11 suggestions or recommendations, included 5 that were focused primarily, or these were recommendations for the Yemeni government, and they included the recommendation to ratify the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. And as we all know, enforced disappearance started to be discussed as an issue of human rights with the establishment of the Human Rights Council, or with the international in 2006 with the call to combat enforced disappearance, and this then leading to the declaration was in 1992, and the convention, which started discussions in 2006 and went into effect in 2010. And we in the Yemeni government have discussed this matter, and there is agreement or approval from the government of Yemen to ratify the convention. And what remains is for there to be parliamentary sessions. And as you know, based on the constitution or the constitutional process, the government has the right to sign conventions and agreements, but it must be ratified by parliament. And we are still awaiting this topic to be included in the agenda of parliament. And when this is done, then international conventions will be an important item on the agenda of the parliament, so that they can be ratified and so that these conventions can be applicable to Yemen. Yes, we all reiterate it, all of us working in this on this file and all of us concerned with transitional justice. It's important for Yemen to ratify these international conventions, which will help set the groundwork for the transitional justice process. Thank you very much, Nabil Abdel-Hafiz. We will now move on to our next speaker, who is Marieke Wierda. But before that, I wanted to tell all of our participants that if you have any questions or comments, you can submit them through the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And so, moving on, I would like to welcome Dr. Marieke Wierda, who is an international transitional justice expert. She is someone who was born in Yemen and returned to Yemen to work as a part of the Dutch mission there. And so she has a very deep understanding of the Yemeni context. She has a recently published book in 2023 titled The Local Impact of the ICC. And in this book, she focused on the impact of transitional justice on peace processes, victims, and several conflict contexts. Her experience includes fieldwork in Yemen and comparative studies with other experiences, giving her a unique perspective on transitional justice and peace in complex situations. And for there to be sustainable peace, there would need to be a clear transitional justice process that is victim-centered and one in which international standards are used without local leadership being compromised. And so my question to Marieke, is how can Yemen benefit from international mechanisms for transitional justice while ensuring local leadership that is victim-centered and includes the participation of civil society?
Thank you so much, Laila, for this great question. Thanks also to Sana'a Center, the Yemen Peace Forum, for raising this important topic, and congratulations on the fact that you're organizing a whole week to call for attention to this important issue. And thanks also to the Deputy Minister for his remarks, because the first comment that I would like to make is from my experience of looking at different contexts in the world. There has never been a successful transitional justice process which wasn't locally led. So even though we can strategically rely on or involve international actors and mechanisms, at the same time, the important players in any transitional justice process are the local actors. And Laila, exactly as you say, victims should be at the center of that. So this is something we've observed in transitions going back to Latin America in the late 90s, also South Africa, but also many of the countries that went through these processes since that. Victims and local civil society had to play the leadership role. So that's the first very important point that I would like to make. But that automatically raises the question of what then is the role of international actors. And here I will distinguish between two kinds of roles. One is the international civil society, and the other one is governments. And so in the international civil society, there are actually very many roles that that society can play to support the efforts of those local actors. And I'll just mention a few of them by example. One of such important roles is that they can ensure that there's a learning process so that different countries can learn from each other. Now, the situation in Yemen is very, very unique. And whatever happened in Syria or in Morocco or in Yugoslavia or Rwanda or any other place can't be automatically taken on board in Yemen. At the same time, those lessons are important because they enable you to avoid mistakes, and they also enable kind of best practices to be followed and inspiration to be drawn. So the international civil society and organizations like the International Center for Transitional Justice can play an important part in that. And also, obviously, other roles that they can play is in the broader capacity building, but they can also themselves do documentation that can be used in transitional justice processes in the future. They can lobby governments in order to create pathways for accountability at the international level. And they can also give technical assistance once a decision is made by the Yemeni authorities to re-engage in the transitional justice process. So just to say that that role of the international civil society is very, very important. And I've seen in many contexts that it can be very effective in supporting the local efforts. So this is definitely an important point and an important player. And I say this because I think very often transitional justice advocates think more about what governments can do for them. And in this respect, of course, governments also have an important role because they are the ones who are coming together in the United Nations, for instance, in either the Security Council or the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council to actually create international mechanisms such as commissions of inquiry, special rapporteurs, investigative mechanisms and even tribunals. And of course, there's also the International Criminal Court where many states come together. So they can play a very important part in setting up mechanisms. And they can also, of course, play the part of being donors to organizations that are promoting these goals, including local organizations. And I'm very happy to mention that the Netherlands has long funded not just Sana'a Center, but several other organizations working on transitional justice. But international governments, of course, also, can ensure that these issues stay alive in the international community and can put pressure. They also have an important role in supporting the Special Envoy and OSESCI. And as part of that, they can also insist that transitional justice is included in the peace process. And again, the Netherlands has already for the last few years funded an expert in OSESCI to be devoted exclusively to transitional justice. First, that was a Dutch lady, and now I'm happy to say it's a Yemeni lady. So these are important things governments can do. And it's a pretty big but, Yemen is at the moment in kind of an unfortunate position, because Yemen is one of the few countries in the world which has a conflict ongoing, but which does not have an international mechanism. And as you'll recall, in the past, there was the group of eminent experts, and now there isn't such a mechanism. And that's, I think, very regrettable. And I hope one day there will be one again, because, and this is my conclusion, I would say the interplay between the local actors who have the ownership of this file, which are you yourselves, the Yemeni, and especially the Yemeni civil society, the way you interact with the international actors can be very strategic and can lead to long-term successes. So in many contexts, I saw that local advocates very effectively engaged the international community to ensure that they could reach their goals of setting up either a domestic or an international mechanism. And I think we've seen this in particular in the context of Syria, which has in the end different kinds of mechanisms, including a commission of inquiry, including an investigative mechanism to prepare criminal cases, and also including a mechanism for missing persons, both at the domestic and at the international level. So I think that interplay is very, very important. I will stop there and wait for the questions. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. I think this discussion is important, the discussion of international mechanisms, and this is something that we need to work towards, especially since, like the Deputy Minister said, since we do not have a transitional justice law, and you also spoke about different contexts and experiences from around the world that we can try to be inspired from and gain insight from to find a solution through national legislation and through international mechanisms to help push this process forward. This brings us back to the topic of the victims and the families of the victims. And this is one of the main themes or topics that we will be discussing. But before moving on to our next speaker, Arwa, I wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions or comments that you would like to submit to the panelists, you can use the Q&A box on Zoom. And now we move on to Arwa, who is a human rights activist and field researcher, and she is a member of both Abductees Mothers Net Association and the Victims Ties Network. Arwa began her journey in civil society while searching for the fate of her husband. who was subjected to enforced disappearance. This experience pushed her to receive intensive training to better understand and know her rights and to raise awareness among other women who were going through similar circumstances. Today, as a member of the Abductees Mothers Association, Arwa dedicates her efforts to carrying the concerns of the families of the abductees and helping them make their voices heard. Here, we would like to highlight the efforts made by the families of the victims and their associations amidst the various economic, social, and livelihood challenges that they face. And so, Arwa, as an active partner with victims associations and families, what are the most prominent efforts you have made in supporting the transitional justice process? And what are the most significant challenges, including the economic, livelihood, and social ones that you face in this context? Over to you, Arwa.
أرحب بالجميع.
Thank you very much, Laila.
وأشكركم
Hello, everyone.
استضافتكم
And I would like to thank
وعمل
you and the
صوت
Yemen Peace Forum and
للضحايا.
Sana'a Center for the invitation and for giving a voice to victims. Can everyone hear me? Yes, we can hear you
طبعا
very
إحنا
clearly,
عملنا
Arwa.
جهود كبيرة من أجل
We have had
مسارات
significant efforts
العدالة
for
في
the
شبكة
process of
روابط. طبعا أنا
transitional justice
أكلمكم
as victims
في هذا المجال
associations.
ولدي خبرة بسبب الاختفاء القسري لزوجي.
I have this, my
والاختفاء
own
القسري
personal
يعد
experience
من
in this
أبشع
because of
الجرائم
my
التي
husband's
ترتكب
forcible
ضد
disappearance,
الإنسانية.
and enforced disappearance is one of the most heinous crimes committed against
من
humanity.
الناحية الاجتماعية نمر بتحديات كثيرة من
And we have
الناحية
been going
الاجتماعية
through many
التي يتعرض
challenges,
لها
including social
أهالي
challenges that
المخفيين
the
من
families of
العزلة
the forcibly
الاجتماعية
disappeared, they are
في
socially
محيط
stigmatized in
الأقارب
many
والجيران حيث
cases. They
يتجنبون
also face
دائما
social
منزل المخفي
isolation, both from
والتواصل مع
relatives and
أسرته
neighbors
بدافع
who often
الخوف.
avoid the home of the
وهناك
disappeared
الجانب
person and contact with their
الاقتصادي
family out
يعني
of fear of the
الكثير
unknown
من
fate
أهالي
that might
المخفيين
also befall them.
إخفاء المعين لأسرته
And in
والمشارك
many
في
cases,
عائلتهم أحيانا يكون
if the person
وغيابه
who is
وإخفاء
forcibly
يعد
disappeared is the breadwinner of
من
the
أشكال
family,
المعاناة
this
التي
continues
يتعرض
to
لها
be,
بعض الأهالي.
and their
فقدان
absence or
الكثير من
disappearance result in many forms of
فقدان الكثير
suffering.
من المخفيين
Many of the
وظائفهم
disappeared, for
وخاصة إذا
example,
كانت
lose their
مخفي في
jobs,
القطاع الخاص
especially if they were
يؤدي إلى
employed
تدني
in the
مستوى
private
دخل
sector, and
الأسرة.
this leads to
هذه أحد
decline in the family's
المعاناة التي
income and
يعانوها
living
الأسرة.
conditions.
وأيضا
This is one
هناك
of the forms of suffering
الجانب
for the families
النفسي
of the
الذي يتعرض
victims.
له
There is
المخفي
also
وأسرته
the
لأنه
psychological stress that
الضحايا
the
الإخفاء
victims
القسري
and the
ليس المخفي
families go
فقط
through, because
ولكن
the
هناك
victims of
أسر
enforced
المخفي
disappearance are
يعتبرون
not those
ضحايا
who were
غير
forcibly
مباشرين
disappeared themselves,
والذين
but their
يتعرضون
families as well,
للصدمات
who are
النفسية.
indirect victims
فكل هذه
and who
الأشياء التي
face
يتعرض لها المخفيين
many
جعلتنا
difficulties
هنا
and
نحن
problems. And all of
كروابط
these challenges that
للضحايا
they face
نحن رابطة
have
مواطن
made us as victims
المختطفين
associations, whether the
شكلت
Abductees Mothers
ميثاق
Association or the
العدالة
Victim Ties
فيها
Network,
عدة منظمات حقوقية وناشطة في مجالات
participated in the
مختلفة وأيضا انضمينا إلى شبكة روابط
joined the
الضحايا.
Declaration
كل هذه
for
الأشياء
Transitional Justice, and
ساهمت
we've also joined other
في
networks for
تقليل من
victims. And all of these steps and
التحديات التي
have
يواجهها
helped
روابط الضحايا.
decrease the
فنحن عملنا
challenges faced
كروابط
by victims
ضحايا عملنا على توثيق
associations.
الانتهاكات من أجل
And
حفظ
our work
حق
primarily has
الضحايا
been to
للمساءلة
document
والتعويض
the
العاجل
violations,
وتقديم الدعم النفسي
to preserve
الاجتماعي
these
لعائلات
files, and also
الضحايا
providing
والناجين.
psychosocial support to the
ونسعى
families of the
لتطوير
victims. And we
برامج
continue to work to
عمل
develop
مشتركة تعني في تقديم الدعم
joint
الفني
programs
والقانوني
that
للضحايا
including technical and
وتمكينهم
legal
من
support to
الوصول إلى
victims
العدالة
in
وجبر
order to
الضرر
enable them to access
مشددين
justice
على
and
أن إشراك
reparations.
الضحايا في
We
عملية
stress
العدالة
here that the
الانتقالية
inclusion of victims in
يمثل حجر
transitional justice
الأساس
processes
لبناء سلام
is
دائم قائم على
a
الحقوق
cornerstone
والمواطنة
of building a
المتساوية.
lasting peace
ونحن
based on rights and equal
كضحايا
citizenship.
شريك فعال
As
مع روابط وأسر
as an active
الضحايا
partner with
يمكن أن
victims
تشمل الجهود
associations and
المبذولة
families,
في
the
إطار
efforts
دعم
made
مسار
within the
العدالة
framework of
الانتقالية.
supporting the transitional
وهناك جهود
process can include
جبارة من كل
the following. And there have been
المنظمات الحقوقية
significant
وروابط
efforts
شبكة
by
الضحايا
legal
منها الدعم
organizations and also
القانوني
victims
يتم تقديم
networks.
المساعدة
But these efforts
القانونية
include
لأسر
legal
الضحايا
support with
في
the
إطار
provision of legal
العدالة
assistance to
الانتقالية.
victims' families
وهناك
within the
توثيق
framework of
حالات
transitional
الاختفاء
justice. The
والانتهاكات
second type of
وضمان
effort is
حقوق
documentation
وتقديم
of
الأدلة.
documenting cases of
الضغط
disappearance and
والمناصرة
violations to secure
الدعوة
rights and
لتطبيق
provide
العدالة
evidence. The
الانتقالية
third effort is
وضمان
lobbying and
حقوق
advocacy, with
الضحايا
advocacy
وأسرهم.
for the implementation of
التوعية
transitional
نعمل
justice and
على
ensuring
نشر
the rights
الوعي حول
of
أهمية
victims and their
العدالة
families. The
الانتقالية
fourth type of
ودورها في
effort is
بناء السلام
awareness and
والمصالحة.
raising awareness
التعاون
about
مع
the importance
المنظمات
of transitional justice and its role
مثل
in building peace
الحقوقية
and
والإنسانية
reconciliation.
لتعزيز الجهود
And the fifth and
المشتركة
final effort is
وخاصة نحن
cooperation with the
عملنا على
organizations, so
تدريب
collaborating with
منظمات
human rights and
المجتمع
humanitarian
المدني في
organizations to
الآليات
strengthen joint
العدالة
efforts
الانتقالية.
and providing
قد
training
تواجه
for
هنا
civil
أحيانا
society society organizations in this field. We also face challenges, and these challenges include the economic challenges of bearing the financial burdens of legal support and psychological treatment. There are also social challenges of confronting the negative societal perception of victims' families. There are also psychological challenges of trying to deal with the trauma and emotional stress of working with victims and their families. As the victims' ties network, we face extreme stress, especially because all of our work is with the families of the victims. A fourth challenge is the lack of resources and the insufficient financial and logistical resources to carry out the necessary efforts. The fifth type of challenges are the legal challenges and navigating the complex legal procedures and dealing with authorities. As victims associations, we try to overcome these challenges through the following approaches. The first is joint cooperation and enhancing collaboration between organizations and relevant entities. The second is seeking sources of financial support to bolster efforts. The third is raising public awareness and community awareness about the importance of supporting victims' families and including victims. And the fourth way to overcome these challenges is training and empowerment by providing training and capacity building for teams working in the field of transitional justice. In conclusion, I don't want to take too long. We recommend the urgent activation of transitional justice mechanisms in our country, Yemen, including truth-seeking commissions, psychosocial support programs, reparation mechanisms, and institutional reform in order to guarantee the non-recurrence of these violations. And another one of our recommendations is the importance of the government ratifying the Convention on Forced Disappearance. And we hope that all of the relevant actors can work together to stop these kinds of violations. The violation of enforced disappearance, a violation that continues to be committed even today. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't take too long with my initial intervention. Thank you very much, Arwa. You spoke significantly about the challenges that victims and victims' families face, and even the humanitarian challenges that they face and the social issues. But one thing that drew my attention was a term that you used when you talked about the social stigma towards the families of the victims. Could you please explain this more to us? Yes, one of the challenges faced by the families of the forcibly disappeared is the social stigma. And we have many examples of this that are unfortunate. One time there was a visit by aid organizations that had been giving a small amount of funding. And when they arrived, when they reached the families of those who had been forcibly disappeared, the person responsible for the distribution in the neighborhood told them that this was a home of terrorists and that they should not provide them with aid. And so these families are families of people who have been disappeared, who have not been convicted of anything, and now they continue to be harmed through this social stigmatization. There was another also problem where they tried to, one of the women was signed up to receive the cooking gas or the household gas, but they were told that they would not be given any cooking gas because their father or the family breadwinner was a terrorist. And there's also the isolation and how society views the children of the disappeared. And this is very unfortunate because this ends up creating a generation who feels isolated and who feels separate from their community. Even if the father had committed a crime, their fates need to be revealed and they need to be tried in a court of law to get the justice. But for the whole family to be stigmatized, they become the direct victim of this, not just the forcibly disappeared, because the person who has been disappeared has disappeared, but the family continues to be deprived. They continue to be deprived of education, for example, because the family does not have an income. They are also, because of the stigmatization, this makes them more and more isolated, and this leads to more and more repercussions from these violations on society as a whole. Thank you very much, Arwa, for this clarification. And I think this makes us all gain a better understanding of the families of the victims. And no matter how much we've worked on these files, I think it's important to also look at it from the perspective of the victims and the families. And now we go back to Mr. Nabil Abdel-Hafiz. there's a question from one of the participants who asks about the coordination between the Transitional Justice Committee and the CRC and the Ministry of Human Rights. What level of coordination is there between them, as well as all of the other bodies whose work is relevant to transitional justice? And what impact might this have on the government's approach to the transitional justice file in the future? Thank you very much for this question. We are in regular contact with two important bodies working on this. The first is the National Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations. We work regularly with them and also refer many of the violations that are referred to us to them, and we continue to follow up any activities that they might carry out when it comes to documentation and building case files. And this can be done through them or through the General Department for Complaints at the Ministry. And this is an important part of the national collective memory of these violations. And the second point, with regards to the CRC, we are in regular contact with the National Reconciliation Committee and also with the Rights and Freedoms Committee in the CRC. And we've conducted an official meeting with the Rights and Freedoms Committee of the CRC in order to coordinate our efforts and also ensure that all of the reports available at the ministry could be made available to them, and that this would be a form of institutional memory building for government institutions. And we are also in contact with the Rights and Freedoms Committee, whether in the Shura Council or in Parliament. There was a question to you from, that was a question from Samah Radman. We now have a question from Marwan, and it is a question to Marieke. And this question is, sorry, just give me a second. The question is, like I said, the question to Marieke, and it is from Marwan Shaybani. And the question is, in your opinion, what are the moral obligations of the international community regarding this issue on the context of transitional justice? And he's speaking about the detention of personnel of international organizations. And how can these obligations be used to ensure justice for the victims, protect humanitarian workers, promote accountability, and build trust? Marieke?
Thanks so much for a very good question. What I would say is that the international community has certain obligations. I would say some of them are in the legal field rather than in the moral field. Morally, there will be obligations too, but legal obligations ought, in fact, to be enforceable. And even though, you know, we see these days also big breaches of international human rights and humanitarian law, even so, these systems still survive, and states have an obligation to also, in fact, under some of the lesser known instruments, but for instance, the Human Rights Council has a set of principles on truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition that many states have agreed to, and they should in fact be supporting processes that give these rights to victims in different countries. So I think there are legal as well as moral obligations. Of course, the Convention on the Enforcement of Disappearances is such a very good example of a instrument that creates such legal obligations. So I do believe the obligations are there. What I think is sometimes, what we're sometimes seeing is that states do not completely comply with their own obligations. And that's where the civil society has still a very important role to keep reminding them that they should be applying these obligations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marieke. And now we will go back to Arwa. Arwa, one of the things that you spoke about is the challenges And so the question is, based on all of these challenges that you mentioned, how can they be addressed in an urgent and sustainable manner from your perspective as someone working on this file and also as a family or a relative of the victim? And so what urgent and sustainable
نحن دائما نطالب من
measures
الحكومة
can be
أن
taken to resolve the
تتبنى
challenges
ملف
that you mentioned?
الضحايا لأنه أنا
We've
سمعت
always demanded that the
إنه من
government
قبل
adopt
كانت
and
وزارة حقوق
champion this
الإنسان
file. In the
تعطي
past,
للأسر
the
الوحيدين
Ministry of
راتب
Human
شهري.
Rights would
نحن
give the
عارفين إنه
families of the
ميزانيتهم
forcibly
ليست
disappeared
الميزانية
a
الكبيرة،
monthly
بس على
allowance.
الأقل
I
يجب
know that their
تخفيف
budget is very
معاناتهم.
limited, but there
على
needs to be
الأقل
steps that are
يجب أن
taken
يكون
to
لهم
decrease the
حصة في
suffering of the
توزيع
victims.
السلع الغذائية
They would need, for
بالمؤسسات
example, to be
ومنظمات
given
المجتمع
precedence in
أو
food
تمكين
aid
الأسر
or food baskets that are
لأجل
distributed
إشراك
or
الأسر في
empowerment.
العدالة
But the
الانتقالية
families of the
من بناء
victims need
قدرات
to also
الأسر.
be
نحن
included in
أني
transitional
كنت
justice
محظوظة
process.
جدا
I was
إني عضو
very,
حركة
very
معظم
lucky to be a
المستضعفين.
member of the
تدربت
Abductees
في
Mothers
مؤسسة أتون،
Association.
تدربت في
I
وجود
received training at the Tubi
يعني
Foundation, at
أصبحت
the Wujud
لدي
Foundation as
وعي
well.
حقوقي.
And so I think
لكن
I have
هناك من
a
الأسر
fuller
التي لا
understanding
تعلم
of
ما
this.
هو
But there are
حقوقها.
families of victims who do
حتى
not even know
للأسف
their
الشديد
basic rights as families of victims of this
المجالات
crime.
الحكومية مثلا إذا
And even
كان في
government
مصير طفرا
efforts. If there's
فهو
someone, for
يشتغل
example, who has been
بالمجال
forcibly
الحكومي.
disappeared and they
للأسف
work in
الحكومة بتراعيش هذه
they're a
الأسرة،
civil servant, unfortunately, the
بتراعيش إن
government
هذه
does not take
الأسرة
this into
يجب أن
account.
يكون
That
ما فيش داعي إنه ينقصوا راتب
there's no need for
الرجل
them to
لأنه مصير
decrease the
طفران
salary of
يقول لك
this
لازم يجي
individual
يبصم
because
أو
they
مش
are
عارفة إيش.
forcibly
طيب
disappeared, saying
كيف
that he has
الأسرة
not
يجب
showed up for
تحضر
work.
المخفي إنه يبصم
How could they
وياخذ
be
راتبه
brought
كامل؟ يجب
to work
أن
if no
تعالج
one knows
هذه
where they are
الإشكاليات
for
التي
the
تعاني
salary
من
to be paid
الأسر
out to their
حتى
families? I think
لما
it's
يتم
important for us to
تسجيل
resolve these issues.
السلل أو
Even when
توزيع
food aid,
السلل
for
من
example,
قبل
is distributed
المنظمات أو من الحكومة،
by
يطالبوا دائما
organizations
إنه
or
يكون
by
مع
the government,
الأسرة شهيد
they
أو
always ask that the
أو
family has
سجين
someone who
مرافقي.
is injured,
طيب
who
الأسرة
has been
المخفين
killed
طفلا
in the
يجب أن
conflict,
يتم معالجة
or that
وضعهم
is
كيف هم
being
بيقدروا يعيشوا
imprisoned.
إذا
But
بيكون
the
هم
families that have forcibly
منسيين
disappeared
كأنهم لم
are
يكونوا
almost
موجودين.
forgotten in
يجب
all of this, as
إنه
if they have
وزارة
no
حقوق
presence, that this
الإنسان
isn't a
أن
problem
تتبنى
and
هذا
their
الملف
suffering isn't suffering.
ويتم
The Ministry of Human Rights needs to
أبسط
champion
الحقوق
this
أن
file.
يتم
Even the
حل
most
هذا الملف سريعا.
basic rights
لا
of
ننتظر
trying to
العدالة
resolve these
الانتقالية
issues for the
التي نحن
families. We do
نتمناه
not need to
مرفوعة.
wait for a
نحن
whole
نتمنى
transitional justice
حلول
process for us to
سريعة على
treat the
أرض
families of the
الواقع
victims
بأنه
properly. We
وزارة
need
حقوق
quick and
الإنسان
urgent solutions.
تتبنى هذا
And I
الملف
think the
بفشل.
Ministry of Human
كمان
Rights is
لازم
well
نقول
placed
إنه
to
هناك
adopt and
للأسف
champion this
الشديد
file.
أسماء
And
مدنيين
unfortunately, there are
معتقلين
also
أي
many
مختطفين أيضا
civilians
لدى
who have
جماعة
been
الحوثيين لا يتم
arrested
النظر
by
لأسرهم
the
أو
Houthis,
درج
and their
أسماءهم
families or
في
their
كشف
names are not
تبادل الأسرى،
included
لأنه
in the
دائما
prisoner
الكشف
exchange lists,
تبادل هو
because
عسكري
the
عسكري
prisoner exchange
لا
list
يتم
always
إدراج
focuses
المدنيين
on
في هذه
military
الملفات.
prisoners, and
هناك
civilians are
كثير
not
صراحة
included in
من
their
الحلول
negotiations.
العاجلة
There are many
والذي على
different
الأقل
urgent
بإمكاننا نحن
and
مساعدة
sustainable
الناس.
solutions that can be implemented, and steps that we can help in advocating and lobbying for. Thank you very much, Arwa. And I think this is definitely the time for the relevant government bodies, and specifically the Ministry of Human Rights, to work to resolving this issue, especially since they forcibly disappeared. They have not been convicted, and there are no clear case files of why they have been detained. And so this takes us to the next question. This question was from Mohsen Saleh, and I think it might be more to Nabil. And he's asking, are there organized and concerted efforts in all governorates to work on the issue of transitional justice through local personnel, or is the focus concentrated in some areas over others? And are there still areas that are considered to be under guardianship while we are seeking to establish transitional justice? This is a question from Mohsen Saleh to Nabil Abdel-Hafiz. Thank you very much for this question. We at the ministry, we have coordinating offices in all of the governorates of Yemen. In some of the governorates, for example, in the governorates that have not been liberated, we have coordinators for these governorates in other that reside or work out of other governorates. And so, for example, in Marib, we have the coordinators for the governorates of Sana'a, for the capital secretariat, etc. And so we have the coordinating offices. We have our coordinating offices in the liberated areas, and for the areas that have not been liberated, we have people working out of the liberated areas. We also have staff working on monitoring and documenting these violations, in addition to our partnership with civil society organizations who are in regular contact with the ministry, and we help work together to issue reports. And all of of these steps, all of the violations that are committed, we also work on documenting and monitoring them and including them in the reports that we submit to the United Nations, to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to the Arab League. We have reports that we submit regularly to these bodies on these issues, in addition to our responses to the questions submitted to us by special reporters, including the special reporters who focus on issues pertaining to transitional justice, like enforced disappearance or others. In addition to that, we also have been doing everything we can to secure the release of any individual who has been forcibly disappeared, whose location is known. And like Arwa has said, unfortunately, the resources available to the ministry are limited, but we do everything that we can to achieve, even if a partial success or a step forward. In the past, we used to provide financial support to some of the families whose members have been forcibly disappeared. We had lists of these victims and the family and the relatives sent to the Supreme Relief Council to ensure that they were given priority in the aid that was distributed. And this process continues. There has been some backslide due to the difficult economic conditions that the country and the government are in, but we hope that there will be significant progress. Yesterday, I was with, and Arwa was with us. We were commemorating International Enforced Disappearance Day, and it was a significant commemoration. It was attended by a deputy or representative from the Ministries of Justice, the Interior and Defense, and all government entities were there. And we continue to work to implement the recommendations of the UPR. And we're currently working on the recommendations that we had agreed to, including the recommendations pertaining to enforced disappearance. There are now efforts to operationalize these recommendations, including a draft Yemeni legislation on enforced disappearance. There are also other draft laws that are being prepared, including, for example, a draft legislation on cyber crimes and many others, or regulations that we are working on drafting in the coming period to help resolve many of these rights violations that are being committed. Thank you very much, Nabil. And from what you've said, I think this leads us to the next question to Marieke. When talking about the relevant international conventions and also the commemoration of the International Day for the Forcibly Disappeared in Aden, Marieke, based on your experience and then the experiences of other contexts or countries, does establishing a day for transitional justice in Yemen, for example, will this help support awareness raising efforts among victims and among society as a whole and support the transitional justice process?
Yes, I think definitely doing that is extremely helpful. And the reason is because, well, first of all, transitional justice, it's always an issue that many people would like to forget about, because there are many perpetrators living in the society and many of them are powerful and they want this topic to be forgotten. So I would say any actions or initiatives that keep the issue alive and that allow people to come together are very important. And also because even though in many situations the victims are not the powerful ones, but they can be very many and they can find solidarity together and they can join their voices and join their demands and find a voice to promote these issues. And I think, for instance, that's why I really appreciated the comments by Arwa and her experiences. In many other countries, actually, women, mothers and wives of disappeared persons were at the heart. They were at the heart of the transitional justice movement. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the mothers of the victims in Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia. And they always, came together every year to recall the importance of knowing or of having justice for the genocide that happened in Srebrenica. And in the end, they have succeeded. But there can be years when you feel hopeless because transitional justice, it's partially about timing. The time needs to be right. But if you keep pursuing justice and if you keep demanding justice, I really believe there will come a time when your demands will be acknowledged and when you will receive that attention. It's just a matter of time because I think justice is such a fundamental issue that it cannot be ignored permanently and it can't be wished away. So that's what I would say. It's very important. So I love this initiative.
من كلامك سيدة ماريكا.
Thank you, Marieke. And from what you've said, we as members of the YPF and also the Transitional Justice Team and the Sana Center want to commemorate on the 1st of September transitional justice. That will be the Transitional Justice Day for Yemen. And through this, and we hope that this is something that can be commemorated every year so that there can be activities and dialogues and discussions as well as awareness raising efforts for reparations for the victims and for them to for their rights to be and dignity to be restored. There's a question here that was directed to Nabil Abdel-Hafiz, and the question is, I'm sorry, just give me a second to read this question. Is the government, are the preparations by the government to sign or ratify the agreement or international conventions, how important is this for transitional justice? Yes, definitely. The issue of ratifying the Convention on Enforced Disappearance is a very important and necessary step in any serious efforts to achieve transitional justice. This is a file that continues to be a significant grievous as a part of any transitional justice efforts. And if we want to move past this, unless we resolve this file, there are also efforts through which we strive to harmonize Yemeni legislation with ratified international agreements and conventions, and these are all important entry points and launching pads for a sound transitional justice process. Thank you very much, Nabil. I think unfortunately we're coming close to the end of our session, but we have a bit more time for an additional question to Marieke. Based on your experience in transitional justice in different contexts and the experiences of different countries, what are the mechanisms and opportunities that civil society in Yemen has an opportunity to be a true partner for these international mechanisms and for it to be a carrier of this process?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because in a way, I guess you're asking, what can you as civil society do to ensure that there will be an international mechanism for Yemen? And I think one of the best things there are two, I think, strategies that are really important. One is to keep gathering the information and to do documentation. Because that is something that any future mechanism can use. And the second is to empower victim organizations and victim voices, because those are the voices that cannot be ignored and that will play a part in the future. So those, I think, are two of the most important strategies going forward to ensure that there will come a time when Yemen again will have also an international mechanism. However, having said that, I don't think the only important thing is to have an international mechanism. I think it could also be, very good if Yemen in the future has a robust national mechanism. And while that may be difficult to imagine now for there to be one mechanism which serves all the victims of Yemen, including those who are living in healthy areas, But in the future, there may come a time when that is possible. And again, Syria is an interesting example. Also, for many years, they only had international mechanisms, and now they will have also their national mechanism. So I think these are the things that we have to keep fighting for.
Thank you, Marieke, for the answer. And we'll now go back to our colleague Arwa. And my question to you, Arwa, from your perspective and based on the work that you've done, the work that you do with the victims' families and also through the various associations, from your perspective, what pathways is civil society taking to ensure the full participation of victims and the relatives in the transitional justice process?
آليات العدالة الانتقالية صراحة هي فيها كثير من الجهود.
We saw that there were significant efforts in transitional justice that would support victims, including reparations, including psychosocial support, and also judicial reforms is a very important point. We as victims in many cases do not have access to the judicial systems. And so accountability and prosecution is one of the most important of these mechanisms that will be in the interest of the victims. But we would also need additional, I think the most important reform or the most important development will be for the victims to better understand what their rights are. The various reparation or accountability mechanisms, in many cases with the families that we've seen, they say that since the victims do not know the rights, they say, if I get some financial compensation, that will be sufficient. Or people say, I want to go back to how my life was, or maybe some semblance of normalcy. Unfortunately, in many cases, when the forcibly disappeared are released, we as civil society organizations try to provide psychosocial support to the victims. In some cases, they might even need medical treatment. But unfortunately, in many cases, they refuse to do any of this because they just want to move on. And they say, okay, I've been released. They're still afraid of being forcibly disappeared once again. And there are no mechanisms to help support the victims through this process. And we as civil society organizations, we should not wait for transitional justice. There are already organizations that have already provided legal support, but unfortunately, many of the victims do not have the necessary awareness to accept this because of their fear and possibly also their lack of understanding of their rights. We as the Abdel-Hafiz Mothers Association and the Victims' Ties Network have worked on capacity building for the victims and trainings on transitional justice, and I think these efforts were very important. And also in the forum for the ambassadors of transitional justice, it includes victims as well, not just activists and human rights defenders, and they wanted to be there and to participate. And I think that this shows that there is increasing awareness, but we would still need additional efforts to raise awareness among victims of the rights. Some people, their perspective might be, if as long as they release my son, that's it. That's all I care about. I don't want anyone to be held accountable. I just want to move on from this nightmare. And that is understandable, but there's also needs to be awareness raising for the victims of what their rights are. From what you've said, Arwa, and this takes us to our next question to Nabil. And the question is, in light of the complexities facing the Yemeni context and also the large number of perpetrators, how can the government balance between reparations and justice for the victims and also the conditions required for national reconciliation, or what are termed the political settlements or solutions that will be implemented in the future? Nabil? On this matter, there are several efforts that have been implemented in the recent period, including, for example, there was a proposal to form a joint government commission, and it will be led by the Ministry of Legal Affairs and the Cabinet and the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor. And this committee will be tasked with presenting a comprehensive perspective on how to deal with individuals who are released from detentions and prison, or those who have been forcibly disappeared. this would start with those who are being detained by the Houthi militias, and there are thousands of them, in addition to those who might be detained by forces aligned or affiliated with the government. And the proposal that we made to the cabinet was that there would need to be a fund to support the victims. And this perspective, we wanted to try to come up with different ideas for how transitional justice would be funded when we start working towards this comprehensive transitional justice process. And so our idea or our proposal was that there would be a fund funded by government entities and also from contributions by the private sector. It could also be through taxes. And this fund would then enable building and operating hospitals to provide psychosocial support for the victims. And also one of the aspects of funding is the funding that will be provided from donors. And I think that this will be a matter that is that will also be important to donors. And this can ensure that sufficient support is provided when it comes to compensating the victims and also providing other forms of compensation through memorialization or psychological and physical rehabilitation through treatments that can be provided to the victims. And I think that all of these steps will help achieve a real breakthrough and take steps forward in the proposal that we made to the cabinet. And we hope that we get the approval for it to be implemented or start implementation next year. We hope that this proposal can come to the light, and I think it'll be an important step towards supporting and protecting the victims of enforced disappearance, because they're an important part, and resolving their cases is an important aspect of transitional justice. I think everyone knows that the transitional justice file in Yemen is a very lengthy one that will cover many different time periods, and there are different actors who are involved in it. But this takes us to the question, and this is a question that I have for all three panelists, and it is, what role can transitional justice play in rebuilding trust between individuals and communities, and also how can it be useful in preventing conflicts in the future? I would like to leave the room open to any one of our panelists who would like to start by answering this question. Could I start, Laila? Go ahead. I think that Yemen has gone through many cycles of violence. From 1948 till 1955, there was a cycle of conflict and an attempt to get rid of Imam Yahya. And then from 1955 to 1962, there was an attempt to end the imamate in Yemen as a whole. And then there was the National Front and the various conflicts in an attempt to end British colonialism in the south. And then there was the conflict between the National Front and the Liberation Front in the south, after which came the conflicts between the Republicans and the Royalists in the north, all the way until the war in 1972, and then the Central Regions War, and then the events of 1986 and 1994, etc., etc., etc. And all of these cycles of violence have led to many crimes and violations being committed. But in my view, I think that what the Houthi militias have done over the past 10 years has been almost equal to all of the other crimes and violations that were committed in the country. And now what this requires from us is real and honest efforts to try to resolve it. We are in dire need of establishing a very central principle, which is achieving social and community peace, which unfortunately has been significantly damaged by the violations that have been committed over the past decade or so. There's a lack of trust between everyone, I think, and I think community peace and safety is something that we all need to work towards repairing, and to also work on repairing our national and collective memory through a transitional justice process.
هل الصورة متوقفة عندي فقط
Did it freeze? Was it just me? No. Sorry about that. I was disconnected for a bit. Marieke or Arwa, would any of you like to answer the same question? And if you could please do so in 2 minutes.
ولو
If I could start.
نبيل يعني هو قال اللي نحن كلنا كنا نقوله.
I think
لكن
Nabil said
فعلا
what we should have all said, and that the Houthi crimes, I think, have been some of the worst, despite the many cycles of conflict. There have been conflicts and even enforced disappearance or anything else, but the very complex violations perpetrated by the Houthis have been the most heinous. Throughout Yemen's history, this use of child soldiers to fight, also the sexual violence that is being used, these are all very heinous crimes that are committed by the Houthis. But when we talk about transitional justice, I think one of the difficulties that we have is setting the time frame, but regardless, it needs to start. We cannot deny that, yes, the Houthis have committed many crimes, but that doesn't mean that we need to stop and focus only on a specific time frame, which is the most recent conflict. There were, in the north and in the south, there have been violations. One of the main violations that have been committed in Yemen's modern history is enforced disappearance. And so we need to focus on all of these time periods, all of these time frames, and we need to reach a point where all of the victims feel reassured. And this is one of the most difficult questions as people working on human rights and on documenting these violations. When someone comes to me and asks me and tells me my father was abducted in 1986 and has been disappeared since then, or someone tells me I lost a limb in 1994 and I was never compensated for it. And we can't even begin to document this. We, as the National Commission, were only documenting starting in 2011. As the Abductees Mothers Association, we focused starting in 2014 or 15. And maybe the ministry has a broader mandate or a time frame, but it's very important that we never ignore or neglect the victims from before 2015. If we truly want peace and reconciliation, it is important that all victims are included, and there needs to be sufficient political will to include all victims from all of the different periods of conflict. And especially the cases where people are still being affected. Someone whose father disappeared in the 80s, they're still suffering. They're still paying the price for this. And so we need to start here. And that's why I think we shouldn't stop at a specific year, especially for these exceptional kinds of violations. Thank you once again, Laila. Thank you very much, Arwa. Marieke?
I think the previous two speakers have made very, very powerful points that I completely agree with. The only other thing that I would add is, transitional justice, absolutely, it should not be selective and it should not focus only on certain kinds of victims. But at the same time, I think also the important thing is that the plight of the victims is acknowledged. And even if it means that they will never get their loved ones back. And they may not even get a full reparation for the crimes or full criminal justice. But I think for many victims, the important thing is that their suffering and their dignity is acknowledged. And this should happen for all victims. So I completely agree with what the two previous speakers have said. And I also think ultimately it's very difficult for societies to move from conflict without a justice process. Because the grievances that happen need to be addressed. And only then can a true and lasting peace take hold. So, I really still strongly believe in that. And I think the other speakers said it much more beautifully.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. We're now at the conclusion of the session in which we heard we listened to a rich mix of insights and experiences from Mr. Nabil Abdel-Hafiz's expertise in outlining official institutional efforts, and to Dr. Marieke Wierda's vision highlighting the importance of international support and multilateral cooperation, and finally to the living testimony of Arwa Fadl, who embodied the will of the victims and their insistence on obtaining their rights. All these voices came together to tell us one thing, that justice is not a distant dream, but a human necessity and a hope that is renewed as long as we believe in it and strive to achieve it. Special thanks to our distinguished guests who enriched the discussion with their expertise and experiences, and to the Yemen Peace Forum and the Sana'a Center for their fruitful efforts in organizing this event. We also thank you, our esteemed audience, for your engagement and valuable contributions. In closing, as the YPF and the Transitional Justice Team, we still want to establish this day, September 1st, as the Yemeni Day for Transitional Justice, a day in which we commemorate and engage with every year in order to raise awareness about the suffering of the victims, and also insisting and working towards the transitional justice process so that we can maintain and preserve the dignity of the victims and concert all of our efforts. Thank you very much. Hoping to see you again. And I would like to reiterate my thanks to the Transitional Justice Team of the YPF for all of your efforts. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.